Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's discussion board, which is another connecting conversation. In this conversation, we're speaking with Ralph Hogan, who is a former colleague of mine working at Mount Wachusett Community College, currently the Assistant Grants Manager. Do I have that title correct?
Close, Assistant Director of Grants.
Okay, fair enough. And he's worked in grant writing capacities. Sorry about that. He's worked in grant writing capacities for a number of years and for a lot of different grants. And so we'll talk a little bit about the beginnings of it to how you landed the job you have now. In this conversation, we're going to speak largely about grant writing. We'll leave the fundraising for other conversations. So can you tell us a little bit just about your work history and how you ended up qualified for this position through grant writing and others?
Sure. I actually had no intention of ever being a grant writer. It was not on my to-do list, which I think is probably true for most grant writers.
It's a horrible job, Ralph.
However, I started as an AmeriCorps member. So I was a volunteer right out of college and happened to land a role working with our college access programs here at Mount Wachusett Community College as an AmeriCorps member. And that sort of morphed into the first stage of my career. And so I worked with our TRIO projects until about 2015, dabbled into the classroom as a teacher, and then ultimately returned back to the Mount to work again with our TRIO programs as the project director for two of those grants. And the TRIO programs are grants, they're federally funded projects. And so I was responsible for the administration of those grants. And then beginning my second year in the role, we were rewriting first our talent search proposal and then our upward bound proposal. And so while I wasn't working directly with as a grant writer, I was doing a lot of the legwork in writing the grant, doing the data collection and analysis, writing draft sections, revising sections that were written by the grants teams that aligned with that. And then a little over a year ago, our executive director of development reached out to me and said, "Hey, as we finish up this grant, have you ever thought about doing this type of work?" And she caught me at a really good time because I was looking to make a shift in what I was doing. And I had really enjoyed kind of doing all the programmatic design and the data collection and weirdly enough, writing. And was able to leverage that into coming into this role. And so as of today, I've been in this job for about a year, for 1 year. I have secured about $1.8 million in funding over the last year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Various different projects ranging from a $2,000 food grant to a just under $1 million adult education grant. And that's kind of what I've been doing for the last year. I've been doing a lot of learning, particularly the grant research end. The writing part, I think I have down pretty good. But the research end, we're still developing some skills on.
So one of the aspects of my job here is grant writing as well. And as much as I'd love to outsource it because it's not my favorite part of the job, I hesitate to do so because I know this organization, right? So who can write about it better than me? So one of my questions for you is moving from writing for a grant that you work for to writing for an entire college. How do you gather kind of the information you need to talk about what other people do well, and what's your process for that?
Yeah, that's actually probably my favorite part of the role is when we go to write a grant, particularly a grant that we've had for a while. So we're going to rewrite it. I get to talk to the folks who are running the program and who are delivering those services to students. And we'll have some very frank conversations about what's working and what's not working. So that way we're just redesigning the program to meet their evolving needs. But what's really great about doing that is you get the chance to really see their passion come through. And I go to every one of those meetings with a notebook in hand, or if it's on Zoom, such as a lot of my meetings are, I'm like rapidly typing, because what I want to do is I want to capture what it is that they're passionate about, what it is that they're excited about, and what are the things that they're doing for our students or for our community at large. And so even though I'm ultimately the one who is writing the grant, as much as possible, I'm using the language and words of the folks who are running the program. So when I write the adult basic ed program, it's my writing, but you're going to hear the voices of the staff who are working in that program in that writing. When I'm doing our C Campus grant, which we'll be doing in a year, I think, it'll be the same thing. I've been working with our C Campus advisor on a couple smaller grants, and it's very clear her passion is standing out in the grants that I'm writing, because I have no idea about adult basic ed or childcare 2-gen programming, but I learn a lot about it from talking to them, and it lets me be able to write grants that are aligned to what their visions are and their projects are. So I'm really just giving words in writing to what they're already able to articulate in other ways.
Yeah, I guess you kind of got a lot of, I would say, like journalistic integrity in your work, which is kind of cool. Do you think because you were already at the college and had some of those relationships established, it is easier for you to step in those meetings? And can you talk a little bit about how that foundation has benefited you?
Yes. So this past year, I wrote a large federal grant for our health career opportunities program, which we should find out about later this week. And I had a very good relationship with the director of that project from when I worked in my previous role. Her and I had collaborated on a few other things. She had been a supporter of a grant that I had submitted for that role. And so those meetings were really good because we were able to have really open dialogue. We had already problem solved some of the things unintentionally just by having conversations in our previous roles. And so a lot of that was able to build on that. Some of the other projects had to be approached differently. When I first started working with our C Campus advisor, for example, I knew about C Campus, but that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge. I knew that the program existed. And so getting to really dialogue with her and learn a little bit about the program really helped me build that relationship. Everyone loves to talk about their work. I don't know if everyone does, but a lot of people like to talk about their work. And so getting to hear from folks about their work and what it is that they're doing, but then also the problems they're trying to solve, because I think a lot of grant programming and grant development can come out of what is the problem we're trying to resolve. And so hearing what those challenges are and their solutions for what potential solutions for those challenges, I think really helped to build relationships, because I'm not there to evaluate them. I'm not there to take their program away. What I'm there to do is help them recognize where their challenges are and then find dollars to help them address those challenges. And so I think that has really helped establish relationships for folks that I hadn't had previous experience with in my previous role.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's super helpful to go in as the person who is trying to solve the problem, as opposed to at the other end of it when you're, when the problem's so far along you don't know what to do yet. You're trying to get ahead of it, which is nice. So my next kind of round of questions for you are about kind of what's challenging for you in both the process of searching for appropriate grants and also writing multiple grant applications simultaneously. And I'll kind of add to that by saying, so I have 2 federal contracts at my current place of work. They were both just up for renewal and thankfully got renewed, but each of them were 18 to 25 page narrative applications. And I just felt like I was saying the same thing in every question over and over again. So I wonder, is it a challenge to you to get creative with the writing? Is it a challenge to find the grants? Where are you finding you struggle? And then, how do you decide what to actually go for?
Yeah. So I'll start with sort of the research. I think on the research side, there's 2 places we kind of look at. We have a very robust strategic plan with a annual operation plan that gets updated. And we really use those 2 resources to determine what are the main goals the college is trying to accomplish. And so we'll try to find funding opportunities that directly align to specific projects that people have identified. Where it can get more challenging is when the project ideas are vague or there isn't a specific project that someone wants to work on. They just know that they need money for operational expenses, et cetera. And I'm sure you're aware of this. There are very few grants that will cover just operational expenses and not do a specialized project of some sort. And so one of the things that we really work on doing with the folks here at the college is helping them figure out what it is that they're actually looking to do with funds, because that really is going to determine where you look for funds and who you might consult as a funder. One of the things I've found in the last year is that you get a little bit more wiggle room with corporate and foundation grants, but tend to get a lot smaller dollar amounts. Whereas when you go with a federal grant or a state grant, you can tend to get a lot of dollars, but very little wiggle room in what the activities that you do are comparatively to the two. A lot of federal grants still.
I agree. I agree completely.
And so I think in researching grants, it's really coming down to where is their alignment? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? And what are funders willing to fund? Because sometimes there are no funders available for a specific type of activity or a specific type of project. And then funders are not always, particularly those foundation funders, are not always super straightforward. They'll say, we support projects that support education. And that is a very broad term. And sometimes you find out by going through their 990s that supporting education really meant they support K through 12 schools. So they're not going to support a college. Or if they do, you'll be the first one. Or you'll find out that they support education programming at other organizations. Sometimes, depending on how detailed they are in their 990, you might find out that they pretty much only give money to do scholarships and not program. And sometimes that's what you're looking for, and so that's perfectly fine. So it really, the research end is really just before you start looking, knowing what it is you're looking for, which I think is for all research, to make your life a little easier. You can do broad searches, like you can definitely do that. And I have a list compiled of grants that I need to look into a little more in depth to see if they align with things. But the more detail you have ahead of time, the better. Your second part of the question was on
so how do you you're writing multiple grants simultaneously, so talk a little bit about, well, I guess one, how you could duplicate information, but two, to go deeper into what you said, how do you decide, do I want to apply for this grant because it'll make me do 3 things I don't want to do, but do the pros outweigh the cons, and fine tuning that?
Okay, so I'll start with the how do we apply, and then I'll talk a little bit about juggling the multiple grants. So we actually have a very robust vetting process that we've rolled out over the last year. We've made adjustments and tweaks as we've gone through the year, gotten feedback from our leadership team and other stakeholders. But essentially, before we pursue any grant funding, we have folks design at least a small concept of what their project is. And when I say small concept, I mean, we're looking for about 350 words outlining the details, and then another 100 or so words explaining how it aligns to our strategic priorities at the college. And so what that does is it makes sure that they know what it is that they're going for, which helps us with grant research if we haven't identified a grant already, or if we've already identified a funding source for them because it's a grant renewal, or it's a specialized programmatic grant we decided to apply for. Then we know how much money they're going to be asking for, who the funder is. We can kind of look at what the funder has done already, and all that information gets compiled into this couple-page form and presented to our leadership team. One of the things that we require is that the person who's looking for funding, so if it's a faculty member or a project director, a dean, that they are collaborating with their leadership team member on that ask. So that way they have at least one champion in the room. And usually we also have the grants department championing for them. But they have at least one champion in the room making the case for their program. And then the leadership team will discuss it. They will look at what the project is doing, the anticipated outcomes, whether or not that is student-centered, which is a big thing in higher education and other education areas. And then we look for the alignment to our strategic plan. So they have to identify which of our strategic priorities their project aligns with. And then we also ask them to talk to our racial equity imperative if the project aligns to that. And not to just jumble up and say, like, yes, it aligns because of X, Y, and Z when there isn't a clear alignment, but we actually want them to explain whether or not it aligns. And we do that because we use all of those factors in prioritizing. So a project that hits every single one of those factors, it's addressing our racial equity goals, it's addressing another strategic goal, it's student-centered, it doesn't cost the college money to run, that's a grant that we're going to want to pursue. Whereas a grant that only hits like 3 or 4 of those might get a little bit deprioritized or chose not to go after if there are other pressing priorities in the grants office. So some of it has to do with annual timeline. There are certain times a year where pretty much everyone's going to get their grant approved to go through development process, and then there are other times of year where it's a little harder. And that's not always up to us. A lot of federal and state grants have very federally stated deadlines. Foundation grants tend to have a little bit more rolling with 1 or 2 deadlines a year. But we kind of do this whole vetting process to make sure everything is aligned before we move forward. And I know from our end, we make sure that it fits into our work schedules in the grants development team. Because some grants require a lot of time and some don't require any time at all. So it all kind of depends. So I think that answered that part.
It does, yeah. And I agree. Some of my grants, it'll take me 30 minutes. Type it up, easy peasy, love those. Some of them it's 2 hours a day for a couple of weeks because your brain can't handle it in larger chunks than that. So that makes a lot of sense for sure. Thank you.
Yeah. And just kind of add that, like some grants, I had a grant that like a $2,000 grant, it took me, like you said, about 30 minutes to write, but then I had a 65-page grant, and that took us a lot longer to write. So and then your other question was on the kind of juggling the multiple grants at the same time, which is literally what I'm doing right now. I have on my whiteboard over here 10 grants. What's that we're working on, all in different stages of development. Some of them we're still waiting for a leadership team to approve. Some of them we're halfway through. One of them actually was submitted last week, and so it kind of depends, and they get prioritized on a couple different things. We look at when the grant's due. We look at how long it is. A grant that takes me a day to write, I can kind of squeeze that in between things in a way that a 65-page grant I can't. We also look at whether or not we have concept papers developed. One of the new things we've started doing this year is we've been requesting folks to actually develop their concept before they know what funding is, so that they fully fleshed out, done a market analysis, and know what their project is going to cost, the impact it would have on the college, both in terms of revenue and expenses. And so that way we're able to more quickly identify funding for them. And we might be able to identify multiple streams of funding. And the best part is when you have an approved concept paper, we use a similar format than what you see in a grant application. We talk about the need, we talk about sustainability, we talk about costs, we talk about project activities that are aligned to those needs that we've identified. And so a lot of that, once we have that concept paper, we can do a lot of cutting and pasting and then just morphing the language to fit what the funder is looking for. And that allows us to be a lot more flexible in those timeframes, because we spend all this time on the concept paper, and now if a grant comes out and it's due in a week, even if it's a 30-page paper, we have a concept paper to build off of. And so that's one of the things that we've been doing. And then you get into the nitty-gritty of the individual project management. And I will tell you, Outlook and Microsoft Teams are my friends. We put deadlines on the calendar for myself and for others, reminders of when the grant's due, reminders of when we want different parts due. I have really been, one of my big projects this past year has been really implementing a Teams process. So in Teams, we have templates for each grant we're working on, where we'll have folders listed for collaborative work on the budget, for the narrative, where people can place letters of support and other documents related to the grant. We have a task tool, so it's like a checkbox for all the different activities, and it's great because I can go in there and I can assign tasks to whoever I want. And I'm going to use a fun word here. We get to manage up a lot, so I'm assistant director of grants, and I'm oftentimes assigning tasks to vice presidents across the college. So there's a lot of times where you're managing across functional areas without like an official manager sort of role. But it's to make sure that the project that they're trying to accomplish gets done. And so there's a lot of times we do that. One of the areas I continue to struggle with is getting everyone's on a regular schedule for grant meetings. At the college, there's a million priorities. Right now is probably the worst time. We got classes starting next week. So trying to get folks lined up to come to meetings when we have people from student affairs, academic affairs, and admissions all on a grant project. It's pretty much impossible to find a time right now where everyone can come to the table. There are other times of year where it's a lot easier. Right now just isn't that time. Yeah. So there's a lot of using what resources we have available, and kind of working through the prioritizations that we've set up through leadership.
Yeah, I resonate. So much of that resonates with me. My entire Outlook calendar is basically just a reminder list for me. Like, I think I have reminders through 2025 at this point. I have reminders annually set for when certain grants will post every year, so I don't forget them. And now that I'm done, I'm through 2 years here, I'm into my 3rd year, I have started to really organize every grant I've applied for in a system, right? So that when it comes up, I don't have to write it from scratch, because nobody cares if you write it from scratch. That's not the point. It just needs to be updated with the successes from the last time you wrote it. So all that organization stuff, I think, is like #1 key to any grant writing. And then the organization lends itself so that when you are doing multiple grant applications, there's a lot you can copy and paste. I mean, how many times do I need to type out our mission and vision from scratch? Our budget, or redacted budget, or whatever, having those documents that are for everything just in a folder of for all grants is really helpful. So that's great info. Just a really quick aside, if students are looking to read more about available grants, where they can find them, what are some of the top 3 or 4 websites you go to when you're looking for new grants?
Great question. So I use GrantStation a lot for foundation grants. I am a member of the Grant Professional Association. And so through that membership, which I wish I could tell you how much it was a year, but I can't remember. Your job just renewed it.
Supports it though, right?
Say that again.
Does Mount Wachusett support your membership in it? Yeah, great.
Yeah, so which is great. I love that. It's always good to have an employer that supports that. But there's a lot of independent grant contractors on there as well. I think it's somewhere around $200 a year. But you get access to a bunch of great training, but you get free access to GrantStation. And then from GrantStation, I'll also use the IRS's website to look up nonprofits. There's also Candid, which works very similar to GrantStation in terms of you can look up nonprofits. And Candid actually has the 990s embedded right there. I always have trouble in there. I'm the only one who appears to have trouble in there getting the 990s though. So that's why I use the IRS website, is to look at the 990s. And that's for foundation grants predominantly. I will say GrantStation does send out a newsletter that also talks about attaches federal funding opportunities and
I get daily emails from GrantStation, multiple daily emails.
And then I signed up for a Department of Ed listing. I've also applied to be a reviewer for Department of Ed, and I can talk about that after if you'd like. I haven't done any reviews yet, but I can talk about the process. And why to do it. And the Department of Ed, National Science Foundation. And so the federal agency websites are really great. And then one more resource, if you decide to go into nonprofits, or if you decide to go into, particularly if you decide to go into education grants, is CASE, which is the Council for Advancement in Schools and I'm butchering it, but they do educational funding. And they do every fall federal funding task force. And so this will be my 2nd fall participating in that. And so I'll actually be going down to DC in October and meeting with federal agencies and talking with them about what their funding opportunities are for community colleges, and getting to hear about them. And we collectively, the task force, puts together this huge report. And so if you're a member of CASE, which does colleges, universities, public schools, sort of advancement work. You can actually access that report for free and learn about all the funding opportunities, when funding will be available. And it's great because sometimes you can learn some really great tips, like the National Science Foundation's. One of the things they emphasized to us last year was like, if you have an idea and you're not sure we'll fund it with the grant you're looking at, email us and ask us, which is not something all funders will do.
Right.
The Department of Ed doesn't give that sort of feedback as frequently as other departments do. And so it's great because you get to meet with the folks, you get to know the folks, and usually the folks who are coming to the table are those federal grant administrators. So they're the folks who you'll be in contact with if you get awarded. And so you start making relationships with them there, which of course makes your life easier should you be awarded a grant. So.
Yeah, I think that relationship building is key at every level. I mean, even for our federal contracts, I have a human being that I can email or call directly, and it's crucial to build those relationships, especially when you're going after the same 4 or 5 sources year after year. It's really helpful to stay in touch and make sure, you're a good partner to them too, because they're giving you a lot of money and they deserve to know what's happening with it, what your plans are, and that it's being used how it's intended to. But yes, I would say I use GrantStation a lot. I use Combis for state contracts.
Yes, yes.
That's the one I will never figure out how to effectively use. I
have a
chaos on that website. Yeah. The website is chaos, and I'll probably recommend to students in most videos to just spend 30 minutes on each of these websites clicking things, because they're all different. Okay, so that being said, we've got about 5 to 7 minutes left here. So I guess my next question would be, we talked a little bit about who you involve in your grant writing process, but because you're at a large organization, I think you're the only person I'm interviewing at a large organization. I know you're connected with institutional research as well. Can you talk about how that collaboration works a little bit more at an organization that maybe has 500 employees as opposed to 50 employees?
Sure. Ultimately, it comes down to every grant is going to be a little different. I think I mentioned earlier I applied for like a $2,000 food grant. That was literally me just sending an email to somebody and saying, hey, I'm applying for this dollars because it supports that project that you got funded through this other way. And so sometimes that's all it is. Other projects are much bigger and involve lots of different people, and it kind of depends on the scale of the project. Right now, for example, we're working on a basic needs concept paper, which we are hoping to leverage for a federal grant in the next year. And for that, we're working with student affairs. We're working with our diversity, equity, and inclusion folks. And we are working with our food pantry folks and our foundation, all to kind of coalesce together to identify what the problems are. And institutional research is actually involved in that as well, because they're helping us develop our sort of research tools to go out and survey students and set up our focus groups. And so depending on the scope and scale of the project, we're going to involve a variety of different departments. And sometimes the only folks we're involving are the folks who are going to be managing the grant. So it really just kind of depends. Institutional research is often involved because we, as a college, we actually collect a bunch of data to begin with. And so a lot of times I can just put in a little request through our portal and get all the data I need to write my needs section. Sometimes that's only supplementing my needs section. It's not all the data I need, but a lot of times I can get at least some things from them. They've been very great in giving us access to a couple different portals and platforms, so that we're not always bugging them for things, particularly during their high volume time frames during the year. And so but there's always like a give and take of like, hey, what's the best data to use for this with them? Almost always the project director is going to be involved. In our ideal world, the project director also is involved in parts of the writing. I know when I was project director for our programs, I either wrote or co-wrote everything except the evaluation plan. Like when I did my up or down program, that was the only part I didn't touch because I was like, I have no idea. You tell me. But it's important I think to get the voice and the effort of the project directors involved, whether it is them sending you bulleted lists, we have some folks who that is what they're able to contribute, and we are more than happy to get that, or them meeting with you and kind of narrating what it is they're looking for. We also like to involve, and this is something that we're trying to be more proactive with, but student voice. And if you're not working with students, whoever your stakeholders are,
Client voice, yeah.
your client voice, because like for our basic needs grants, for example, the funding we're looking at funds 2 out of 8 different challenges. And what we're trying to figure out is, well, what are the challenges that our students are experiencing? But then also we're looking to our students to give us some ideas about what they think might be the solutions that they want. Because we might think that we know what our clients or what our students are looking for. And then we might find out we're wrong after we have spent, $1 million of taxpayer money. We don't want that to be true. So what we want to be true is we have efficiently used taxpayer funds or other funders' funds to meet the needs of our students in a way that is what they're looking for. And so getting the voice of your clients, the voice of your students is critically important. I love to see that seems to be something a lot of folks are pushing more than what they've done in the past. And that, I think, is the biggest advice I can give is don't just assume you know the right solution or the needs of your population. And don't assume that the data that you can collect from public sources is going to give you all of that. That qualitative data you can get from your clients is going to be super helpful in design of your project.
I agree. I really appreciate that. And it's what I try to do here too, right? So this is my first time leading a nonprofit. Even though I've been here for 3 years, there's always more to learn. And I'm not a veteran, and this is a veteran serving organization. So who am I to decide what they need? You have to talk to them to figure it out. And I would say one of the things that I miss about being at a larger organization is the opportunity to bounce ideas off people and get their insight, and gosh, to have an IR portal to just get data from. So it's not just me on Excel spreadsheets. I think that's an invaluable part of it, especially because grant writing can otherwise be really isolating. And so the more you get out and use that journalistic part of the job, that the better the grants are going to be, and the more fulfilled you're going to feel. So you don't feel like you're just working in a cave all day, and that's not how it should be anyway. Okay, so my last question for you would be, so I'm not sure yet where these students are at with their experience levels in grant and fundraising. So what advice would you give to someone writing for their first small grant, maybe say under 25,000, and how might that differ from advice you may give to somebody writing for a larger grant, maybe 100,000 or more?
Sure. It's funny because literally I did both of those for the first time this year. So I mean, technically I've applied for the large federal grants before, but I wasn't the sole writer back then. And so I think I don't always necessarily think I would differentiate between the amount. I think the best advice is to differentiate on the type of funder. And so I'll start with like your government funders. So your state and federal funders, really read very closely, mark up, print out, do whatever it is that you do, the RFP or the notice of funding opportunity. And when applicable, look at regulations. Some grants have very clear regulations about what you can and cannot spend dollars on. There's a general for federal grants. There's a general CRF 200, which speaks to general funding practices for grants and whatnot, and spending practices. Become familiar with those things. You do not want to submit a grant that requests something that you cannot spend dollars on. And it's important to look both at the general rules, but then also program specific rules if they exist, because sometimes there are things that you cannot buy it under general rules, but because of specific legislation, a specific funding source does allow you to buy it. I used to run 2 TRIO projects, for example. One of them very explicitly, I can buy t-shirts. The other one, we could not buy t-shirts. it seems like a little thing. They both are serving the same types of students. They're both doing a lot of the same types of activities.
Mhm.
But because of how they were funded and some slight differences in how the programs work,
Mhm.
that was a difference in funding. And that was from the same funder and really the same legislative space.
Yeah.
So really know what they are and leverage the folks who are running those programs or who will be running those programs to know that too. So you should not be the only one who knows it,
Mhm.
unless you're a one person shop, in which case you
I'll
do
figure
that.
it
Yeah.
out.
Foundations, you're going to have a little bit more flexibility. And I'm going to admit right here, I'm much newer to foundation grants. I have written very few of those compared to state and federal grants in the last year. And my previous experience was all federal grants.
Mhm.
So foundation grants, you have a little bit more wiggle room, but it's also usually harder to figure out what the funder is looking for.
Mhm.
There are some foundations out there that have, just like federal government, websites with everything they're looking for and exactly what they want in the RFP. And
Mhm.
then there are others out there that you have a contact, and you might
Mhm.
actually have to send it in via mail,
Yes.
snail mail with a stamp and everything.
Yes.
Uh,
I had one of those this year, and I was just like, y'all have an email address?" And they're just like,
yep.
"No."
I was at a training a couple weeks ago, and they were talking about how even just a few years ago there were some grants you used to have to hand deliver. And so know what the funder is looking for in terms of delivery, but then sometimes you have to reach out to the funder, and don't be afraid to do that. And just ask, hey, is this a project that you would fund? When I was at that training, I was just speaking about, it was with Philanthropy Massachusetts, and they had a bunch of funders from Worcester, Massachusetts, or the Worcester County rather, talking to us about what they're looking for. And one of the things that every one of the people on the panel said is reach out to us and let us, if you're not sure the project fits into what we're doing, reach out to us. And that's not a bad thing to do, because it does two things. One, especially if you haven't written for them before, it's introducing you to that.
Mhm.
And a lot of times, funders don't fund people who the first contact is an application.
Yep.
So reach out to them, get to, see what they do. And the second side of that is sometimes you find out that even though their language on the website might make it sound like they wouldn't fund that project, they might be really excited, or they might have another funding source within their organization that does fund that. Because I found that out a couple times this past year as well.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to talk to foundation funders. I would also say don't be afraid to talk to federal funders, but some people are.
They're
So
harder to find though. The foundations are so much more local, and they want to talk to you.
they do.
I one time I had a funder who would not accept an application from anybody they didn't have a conversation with. And in that conversation, what she said was, "You're not asking us for enough money. We want you to ask for more." And I would have never known that. I doubled my ask simply because of a 20-minute Zoom call. And then I got it because of the 20-minute Zoom call.
Yeah.
So yeah, those local foundations are nice.
Yeah, they can be, and they tend to, particularly if your project is impacting the local community,
Mhm.
that's what they're looking for.
Yeah, I have also found with especially the ones that are no website, just some guy with an in memorial foundation will say, we're not going to fund this right now, but in a year or so, when your goal is a little further along, we'll fund you then. Don't forget about us. And that's great feedback as well, that you're not going to get from a larger federal or state agency who could just move on to the next. If you're looking for funders like me, just Gardner Winchendon, it's a lot different. So
And I will also say this: in the event that you do not get funding,
yeah.
Your federal and state grants will tend to send you a sheet that will have like your score and will explain why you got that funding. Read that very thoroughly before you apply again. Your private funders tend not to do that, but if you reach out to them, they tend to tell you whether it was like, oh, we just, we didn't like that project, or we just didn't have the funds for it this year, but we think if you applied next year. So get that feedback, because they might not have liked the way you presented the project, but they might like the project. And so that feedback can be used to apply in the future year.
Yeah, that's all great advice. And I really like the correction of it's not so much the dollar amount, it's the funding source that you approach differently. So that's really great advice. Thank you. And with that, I think we've hit actually just about 40 minutes here. So I really appreciate the conversation, Ralph. Thanks for chatting with me today.
Of course.
Thank you. So for anybody, students watching, you'll have your discussion board prompts below. If you want to read more about Wachusett and some of the grants, I'll post some links below for you to reference as well. And if we used any jargon that you don't understand, make sure to put that in the discussion board and I'll clarify it for you too. Thanks.